You may have heard of the case of three Al Jazeera journalists who are being detained in Egypt. They're on trial for, according to the authorities in Cairo, they're on trial for spreading false news and belonging to a terrorist group. These three journalists are Peter Grest, Mohammed Fahmy, and Bahir Mohammed. I believe there was a fourth individual involved, but I'm not 100% sure about that. Al Jazeera strongly denies the charges and condemns the fact that these men are being held in these conditions. And they've started a campaign saying journalism is not a crime. They spread this campaign all over the world, and a lot of people have supported that. I think the way Egypt is behaving is an utter disgrace. Clearly the claims are preposterous, belonging to a terrorist organisation. There's absolutely zero evidence that I can see that any rational person can see that these men are terrorists. I think this is a classic case of an authoritarian government that doesn't like any reports that may scrutinise some of its behaviour, and therefore it decides to turn on the media. But I want to make a wider issue. You know, for most of us sitting in our living rooms, in our bedrooms in my case, looking at the news, reading newspapers all around the world, with reports all around the world, it's very easy to criticise the media, and I often do. There's always a debate about biased media and that sort of thing. But in terms of frontline reporters, and this is something that interests me because at university I studied journalism and editorial design. I had an ambition of being a frontline reporter. That never happened, and it's unlikely to now. But I had a deep interest in the subject, and I've always had enormous respect for the sort of dangers these people face to bring news to those of us who don't have to face this situation every day, i.e. political turmoil, conflict zones, human rights abuse allegations, these sort of things. Unquestionably, being a frontline reporter must be one of the most challenging jobs there is. And unlike soldiers, they have no way to protect themselves when violence does occur. So we have to respect what these people go through. I believe it's something like 500 journalists have been killed in the last decade in various war zones around the world. I think Iraq topped this as the most dangerous place for journalists. Mexico is pretty high up there. But there's many countries where being a reporter is a real serious risk. The issue of press transparency is related. It's another issue, but it is related. And it's definitely a case that people don't underestimate what reporters go through. You know, we always hear about media bias and so on, but people sometimes overlook the fact that sometimes it's incredibly difficult for reporters to get the sort of information they need to make a comprehensive report. So for example, if they're in a country like China, whereby the authorities heavily scrutinise any sort of foreign media reports of sensitive cases, such as, for example, if a dissident is on trial, it's very difficult for foreign reporters to actually give a comprehensive report, because quite often in the case of China you get thugs who are quite possibly CCP agents roughing them up or pushing them around and basically trying to stop them filming. Clearly that's not a transparent society. China's not a transparent society. It has improved a lot, and there's no comparison to be made with North Korea, but I just use that as an example because China is obviously a very prominent country. And I also use it as an example because a lot of Chinese people criticise biased Western media, but I think they don't understand, or they don't appreciate how hard it is for Western journalists to actually report inside China. And I would urge them to consider that fact. The fact that it is not easy to report news inside China unless it's pro-government news. In the case of China, usually journalists' lives aren't threatened, but in other parts of the world it is a real life and death situation. I remember there was a Japanese journalist, she was killed reporting from Damascus a few years ago towards the start of the Syrian civil war. And if you look at her final videos, it's a little bit eerie, seeing just, she was literally dodging bullets. And it isn't just the reporters themselves, it's their camera people who often face dangers. So being a frontline reporter not only takes immense courage, but also a lot of, I think it takes psychological strength and also intelligence, because you need to know what sort of contacts to make in order to get a report. You need to know how to be diplomatic, and I also think desensitized. Frontline reporters may see atrocities, and they have to hold themselves back from the human element, i.e. not taking sides. So if, let's say a journalist sees Party A massacring civilians of Party B, their human instinct would be that's awful. I'm enraged. I've seen women and children slaughtered in the street. My blood is boiling. I really want to show what's happening here. But then the journalistic ethics would be show both sides. And then of course, they're always going to, in a war situation, journalists are always going to be accused of taking one side or the other. And it is true, in many circumstances the networks themselves are biased. But I think it's unfair to necessarily attack the journalists on the ground for that, because they don't necessarily always have leverage over how they report things on the ground. Sometimes they are given instructions from above, and that's when you get cases of journalists resigning from their networks because they can see that there's an agenda and a bias. Pretty much every network has some bias, but we should try and be more respectful of journalists on the ground. I'll give an example. I hate Russia Today, but that doesn't mean I would want any RT journalists to be in any danger or to face any threats because they are from RT. I still criticise maybe their reporting and the fact that RT is such a biased channel. And the same applies to Fox and Fox News and pretty much every network. There's some I admit that I have a preference to, but to give examples, RT and Fox are two that I have contempt for. Al Jazeera I've criticised for its bias in the Israel-Palestine conflict, i.e. its bias against Israel, but that does not mean that I would want Al Jazeera journalists to be in danger. These people are trying their level best in most circumstances to just do their job, and when they're having to deal with a dictatorship or an authoritarian regime or warlords or criminal gangs, going up against that takes immense courage. But it's also they need to be diplomatic. To be a frontline journalist, you have to be diplomatic. And thinking of the plight of these Al Jazeera journalists just reminds me of and the thing about frontline journalists is they I don't think they really get recognised as much as they should be. They get recognised within their industry, but they don't really get the respect they deserve. I mean, when a soldier dies, and this might be a controversial comment, but he will be treated as a national hero, and arguably that's rightly so, because he's died for his country. But when a journalist dies reporting a major story, bringing history to our living room, they don't necessarily get the respect they deserve from the average Jill or Joe on the street. And the same, I would argue, applies to aid workers who also take huge personal risks, but I might make another video about that specifically. Journalists, frontline journalists, are people who are trying to document history as it happens, and sometimes it is impossible for them to get the whole picture out there because they're prevented from doing so. And I would invite anyone to read some biographies of these people, because that shows first-hand accounts of exactly the sort of ordeal and challenges that they have to go through. Quite often, also, frontline journalists suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. They often develop severe alcohol problems and so on. It's similar, actually, to the sort of symptoms battle-hardened soldiers go through. These are not only brave people, they're physically and mentally very strong people. And I hope these men are released, but I would defend any journalist's right to freely report on any story, so long as they're doing their level best to report the truth as they see it. I will always criticise networks, but journalists on the ground I have a bit more sympathy with, because quite often they have their hands tied. They're trying their level best to report the story as they see it. Maybe sometimes they're under directives from above, but that still wouldn't justify threats against them. I'm not saying they're above criticism. If there's a journalist who's clearly making a biased report, he or she should be criticised and scrutinised and challenged. But if they're in a situation where they're in a country such as China that doesn't give them the freedom to make a thorough report, that criticism is just invalid, because they're being put in an impossible position. So just to round this video off, I have enormous respect for these people, and I think people need to appreciate what frontline journalists, the sort of threats they face, and the sort of bureaucratic challenges they often face. When I say threats, I don't necessarily mean always life and death threats. Sometimes it could be the threat of being in a dingy prison for days on end, or having their equipment destroyed, or being roughed up. There's a wide range of things that journalists have to face, these sort of journalists. Now there's another type of journalist which I have absolute contempt for. For example, tabloid reporters within a country who are just interested in destroying lives. I have no sympathy with them. But foreign correspondents, frontline reporters who go to some very dangerous places to try and bring news to viewers at home, they're human beings. They cannot be expected to get the story 100% comprehensive if they are not in a position to do that. All they can do is work with what they have to the best of their ability, and I do think they deserve a lot of respect for the risks that they take. And as Al Jazeera says on their intro page, journalism is not a crime.